We're really glad you're here. This is, I think, our fifth or sixth one of these sessions where we are going through the author bank that CLT uses to bring in passages onto our tests. We use about 2/3 of the passages that you'll find on a CLT are drawn from the authors on the author bank. And there's an amazing group of authors on there. So I hope you have had a chance to scroll through that list and really, notice ones that you're familiar with, which is hopefully a number of them, but I'm sure there's some unfamiliar names to you too, and that you are, it's piquing your curiosity. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this journey through the author bank was to give more explanation behind these authors, to bring them to life, to really engage with them, and to have wonderful professors from our partner universities and colleges to be able to talk to you and to hear from you your questions about them. We hope this is a gift to you, that you have this opportunity to encounter these wonderful scholars that have taken a good amount of their academic career to study the people on our author bank, and really have their expertise in these areas. So I am going to tell you just a little bit more about CLT and why we do what we do. CLT really believes that not just introducing you to some of these authors, but also helping you engage with them is not a terrible way to take an assessment. We all, assessments are kind of a part of American academia right now, and have been for a number of years. But if you have to do it, then let's make it beautiful. And we really want you to engage with these texts and to be able to read them well and to answer questions about them. We really also believe that there are wonderful benefits to taking the CLT. If I can share, I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully, can you see this slide that says benefits of CLT? Awesome, great. So with CLT, our approach to assessment is a little bit different than maybe some other assessments you've become familiar with. We really value your time. We know that, again, it's maybe not everybody's favorite thing to do on a Saturday or on a school day is to take an assessment. It kind of wipes you out. They're long, they feel like a brain drain. But we want to make it so that you can take this assessment, you feeling, maybe invigorated by some of the tests or the passages that you're reading, and that you've only spent 2 hours on it. We want to invite you into the great conversation as well. You'll be reading beautiful passages from some of the greatest minds in history. Authors like Virgil will be on the passage, passages from Virgil will be on the test. You'll find G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Aquinas, Augustine, just amazing minds that have really spoken into our culture over the last several thousand years. You will connect with great colleges with CLT. So our partner colleges are really looking for students that have had the types of education you're getting and that you're pursuing. And like I mentioned a little bit ago, I didn't have this opportunity to get exposed to the great books at all until I went to college. And so I didn't know anything about it. But the benefit that you have is that you are already encountering and engaging with these things. And it will, I think, just better prepare you for being in those classrooms, like at Baylor or other wonderful colleges. CLT can help you learn about your strengths as a thinker. Your analytics should help you to kind of know where your strengths and weaknesses are. Where did you do well? Where are some things that you can sharpen and focus on and think about as you are continuing to hone in your own skills on your education? And then you're in control of the recruiting status that you decide to do. You can opt into to being recruited by our partner colleges and universities. You can share your scores for free, and you don't have to make that decision prior to the test. You can make that decision after you take your test, and you can share those scores for free. So we really hope that those are some things that you'll find as a benefit as you take CLT. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I am going to introduce our speaker, who is with us this evening. And just one second here as I get out of my, there we go. Okay. All right. So we are just absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Julia Hejduk with us this evening. She is a scholar at the Honors College at Baylor University. She is the Reverend Jacob Beverly Stiteler Professor of Classics, and she's the Associate Dean at Baylor. She has been there since 2003 and had spent some time prior to that at the University of Texas in Arlington. She holds a BA in Classics from Princeton University and her MA and PhD in Classics from Harvard University. So clearly, she has nothing really important or interesting to say about these things. She really doesn't know what she's talking about. Those are the kind of people we like to have on with us, right? So we're really excited about the credentials that she brings this evening. Her research specialty is in Latin poetry with a focus on religion, women, intertextuality, and acrostics. And if you have questions about what those things mean, you can drop those into the chat later. We'll be doing our Q&A. And she's written a number of articles and several books and essays. We are just, again, thrilled to have Dr. Hejduk with us this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to her at this time and ask you to listen. And then towards the end, we'll be taking some Q&A, both about Virgil, but then also about what is happening at Baylor that you might be interested in as a potential student. So please give Dr. Hejduk your full attention. Thanks.
All right. You froze a little. Is it time? All right.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Wonderful. Please. So thank you so much. This is such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate all you showing up, and it's always a great delight to talk about one of my favorite texts, which the subtitle of my talk is The Greatest Text. And I'm going to explain a little bit later what I mean by why is it that Virgil's Aeneid is the greatest text. So if you were given half an hour to summarize the Bible, its stories, its themes, its reception history, whatever it's most important for readers to know, what would you say? Virgil's Aeneid is a text that historically has been almost as central to the humanities' great conversation. And though it's a connected story by a single author, in some ways it's even harder to summarize. It's a poem I've been reading for more than 35 years, but every time it's different, because every time I'm different. I've come to see it not just as a text, but as a lifelong companion. Something similar could be said about the world's response to the epic as well. As I wrote in a recent monograph on Jupiter and Augustan poetry, the one consistent trend in Virgilian interpretation throughout the centuries has been to unearth ever deeper layers of complexity, unsettling old certainties, and finding in the inexhaustible richness of his poems one of the truest mirrors of the insoluble conundrum that is human life. Though the Aeneid may not be the best text ever written, there is a real sense in which it could be called the greatest text. It stands at the very center of the great text enterprise, that conversation among important books, which is the lifeblood of Western thought and the heart of classical education. It absorbs and transforms all previous literature, from the sublime epics of Homer and the tragedies of Euripides to the shaggy Roman writers feeling their way in a new idiom. And it becomes an inevitable source for everything that comes after. If no actor is more than 6 removes from Kevin Bacon, no serious work of Western literature is more than 3 removes from Virgil's Aeneid. As Jan Jolkowski observes, to describe the epic as a bestseller would make sense only if the customary noun were better seller. What explains the poem's fascination? Partly, this is due to Virgil's fourth eclogue, in his first published collection, written about 2 decades before the Aeneid. That mysterious poem, which prophesies the birth of a miraculous child who will usher in a new golden age, was seen as a pagan prophecy of the birth of Christ. As I argued in an article a few years ago entitled, "Was Virgil reading the Bible?" It is actually fairly likely that he was intentionally channeling Jewish messianic prophecies from the book of Isaiah, as well as the story of the fall in Genesis. In any case, it is undeniable that Virgil became the bridge between Greco-Roman antiquity and the strangely persistent cult that sprang up about 50 years after his death. Pagans and Christians alike were eager to claim him for their team. He was both a sage and a seducer, a compendium of all philosophical wisdom, but also a temptation that could lure the innocent away from the simplicity of the Gospels. In short, a perfect symbol of the road both into and out of Jerusalem that the life of learning has always been. Examples of this influence come readily to mind for those familiar with the traditional great texts canon. You may know how St. Augustine laments wasting tears on Dido when he should have been weeping for his own soul, or how Virgil guides Dante through the Inferno and all but the very end of the Purgatorio. But are you familiar with the key role he plays in Everhelm and Onulf's life of St. Poppo, abbot of Stavelot? There we hear how the good abbot healed a poor monk named Gozzo, who was afflicted with a peculiar case of Virgilitis, one in which sage and seducer are both very much in evidence. He cried out suddenly that a troop of demons was assuming the appearance of Aeneas, Turnus, and other characters from Virgil, and that he was being assailed to his very soul by those who in learning had been of the most value to him. A glance at the volume of reflections by modern scholars that I edited a few years ago, ironically entitled, "Happy Golden Anniversary, Harvard School," will show that Virgil's spell extends even to our own times. As I note in the introduction, Aeneas and Dido, Turnus and Mezentius and Camilla have become for us real people, friends and enemies who inhabit our imaginations and stir our emotions no less, often more, than the ones with whom we exchange daily pleasantries. The arguments over what Virgil stands for sometimes seem less like the defense of an intellectual proposition than the defense of a homeland. The battles over a Virgilian interpretation, often crudely characterized as optimism versus pessimism, or the European school versus the Harvard school, occur partly because Virgil really does leave clues that point in opposite directions, both piquing and frustrating our desire to find the answer. All translation is interpretation, and even a single word can give rise to impassioned controversy. Just one example. In the 6th line of the Aeneid, we hear that Aeneas will bring gods into Latium, which is in central Italy, inferret deos latio. The verb inferre, bring in, can be used of bringing votive offerings into a temple. It can also be used of bringing in an army with hostile intent. John Dryden captures the first meaning, his banished gods restored to rights divine. C.D. Lewis suggests the second, marched his gods into Latium. Should we see Aeneas as a sympathetic refugee or as an aggressive imperialist? Throughout the poem, the answer appears to be both. Virgil is the quintessential poet of civil war, where people of the same nation, who ostensibly share similar values, come to opposite conclusions that tear their society apart. Does that sound at all familiar? Rome began with Romulus and Remus, one brother killing another. The shadow of that fratricide hangs over all of Roman history, and the era in which Virgil grew up was one of particularly bloody civil wars, first between Julius Caesar and Pompey, then between Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian, who would later become the Emperor Augustus. Virgil died in 19 BC, with the Aeneid still unfinished, but he had begun writing it a decade earlier. The Battle of Actium, in which Octavian's forces vanquished those of Antony and his Egyptian consort Cleopatra, had taken place in 31 BC. A New York Times article artfully entitled, "Why Wasn't It Grapes of Glee?" points to a correlation between the literary misery index and the economic misery index from the previous decade. The Aeneid was born in a decade of tumultuous transformation, an age poised precariously between the fresh memory of civil war and the hope for lasting peace. What gives the poem its universal pull is partly this precariousness. We hear the constant counterpoint between the voice of empire and the voice of grief, the focus on future greatness, alongside deep compassion for the exiled, the suffering, the losers. Tantai molisserat Romanam condere gentem. Such a massive thing it was, a thing of almost unimaginable weight and cost to found the Roman people. The Roman Empire rests on the backs of those who lost their homes, their loved ones, and their lives when Aeneas and his people took over Italy with no other justification than fate. Far from minimizing the moral complexity of empire, Virgil amplifies it at every level, and especially in his depiction of the gods. At first, the basic framework seems simple. Troy has fallen, but Aeneas will survive to plant the Trojan remnant in Italy, fighting a war with the native peoples and finally merging the Trojans with them to form the society that will give birth to Rome. As Jupiter famously declares in his opening prophecy, "Upon these, the Romans, I place no limits in time or space. I have given empire without end." What makes it difficult to get there is the persistent blocking action, what Dennis Feeney calls a multivalent frustrating negativity by the goddess Juno. She knows she cannot ultimately stop her enemy, yet she still wants to drag things out, add delays, hurt him by making his people suffer. But by the end of the poem, Aeneas's immortal enemy has been ostensibly won over to the proto-Roman cause, and he kills his mortal enemy Turnus, thus paving the way for him to marry the princess Lavinia and continue the line that will give birth to Rome. The problem is that even the basic Juno bad, Jupiter good model is fraught with difficulties. Of the three reasons given for Juno's fury against the Trojans, one is pure wounded vanity. The Trojan prince Paris chose Venus over her in the world's most fateful beauty contest. But the other two, the hated race and the honors of snatched up Ganymede, are from her husband's philandering with Trojans. The race was hated because it sprang from Dardanus, offspring of Jupiter's affair with Electra, and Ganymede was Jupiter's Trojan boy toy, plucked off a mountaintop by the god's eagle. Does it make sense to put all the blame on the jealous wife when her husband's infidelity is the cause of her rage? Moreover, readers have long been disturbed by the way Jupiter channels Juno at the end of the poem, when he sends a hellish fury to torment Turnus, just as his wife sent a fury, perhaps even the same one, to infect Turnus and others to help get the war started. But what I find even more disturbing is that the only things Virgil's Jupiter cares about are fama, fame or reputation, and imperium, empire or power. He is entirely indifferent to things like beauty, love, human happiness, or suffering. In short, he doesn't give a fig for the liberal arts. He would not do well on the CLT. Juno, by contrast, exhibits actual compassion for both Dido and Turnus, Aeneas's primary antagonists. When Dido is in her death throes, but cannot die, Juno intervenes for no other reason than because she pitied her long suffering. A notable German scholar wrote that the idea of Juno weeping is undenkbar, unthinkable. And yet she is clearly and unambiguously weeping, ad lacrimans, when she pleads with Jupiter in Book 10 to let Turnus live just a little longer. Juno may be a demon, but in many ways Jupiter, the mouthpiece of fate, is even worse. Against such a divine backdrop, what becomes of a man like Aeneas, the paragon of pietas, not just religious piety, but a deep sense of responsibility toward all who are connected with him? Such is the problem of evil, as Virgil formulates it at the beginning of the poem. Why did she make the man of pietas endure so much misfortune and undergo so much suffering? Is such wrath in the hearts of the gods above? That question of the suffering of the innocent is the one that matters. And any philosophical or theological system that does not put it front and center is of no value whatsoever. The Aeneid confronts it head on, intertwining it mysteriously with the grand narrative of human history and of individual human life. In stark contrast to the Bible, Virgil's poem lacks the guiding agency of a loving and beneficent God. The only prayers Jupiter answers are those which contribute to Roman imperium, and individual happiness or suffering is of no importance to him. Can the epic hero, persecuted by divine wrath and executing the dictates of fate, nevertheless be a model for us on our life's journey? The role played by the Aeneid in the intellectual and moral formation of countless generations of our ancestors, and potentially in ourselves and our descendants, gives that question a certain urgency. I believe he can, but only if we face up to the darkness and recognize the many ways in which our hero is a failure. As a husband and lover, he is a disaster. We all know the stirring image of Aeneas escaping from Troy, carrying his father on his back and holding his little son by the hand, the perfect emblem of the present bearing the weight of the past as it guides the future. His wife, Creusa, however, is not in the picture because he told her to follow our footsteps a long way off, servet vestigia longae. That she got left behind is entirely his fault. Now, I realize the plot requires that Aeneas not have a wife in tow, but Virgil could have shown her dying in his arms. And as for the affair with Dido, as if it's not bad enough for a lonely woman to have a handsome stranger wash up on her shore, she has her emotions manipulated directly by Mercury on Jupiter's orders, then has Cupid, disguised as Aeneas's son on Venus's orders, breathe hidden fire into her and deceive her with poison. Aeneas, by contrast, gives in to his passion of his own free will. Dido was a just and successful ruler, courageously building her society in adverse circumstances, until Aeneas came along and ruined her. As she says, happy, oh, too happy, if only the Trojan keels had never touched our shores. Dido's suicide is devastating evidence that erotic love, which our society likes to stir up casually in order to sell things, is a force more powerful than Jupiter's thunderbolts and more dangerous. But when Aeneas encounters her shade in the underworld, he's as clueless as ever. His main self-defense is, I couldn't believe I'd hurt you that much by leaving. As a reader, Aeneas is also a disaster. When the storm sent by his archenemy Juno blows him off course to Carthage, her favorite city, he comes upon a temple to that goddess decorated with scenes from the Trojan War. Most of them depict moments of particular suffering, loss, and defeat for the Trojans, such as you would expect to find on their enemy's temple. But what is his reaction? There are tears for things, and mortal affairs touch the mind. Don't be afraid, fame will bring salvation. This is a model of misreading, of how our own hopes and desires can sway us and blind us to the plain meaning of what we see. Sometimes he's prevented from reading what could have had an impact on his own self-perception. On the doors of the temple near the entrance to the underworld, depicting the labyrinth and scenes from Cretan legend, the scene Aeneas is about to read when the Sibyl yanks him away is probably that of Theseus abandoning Ariadne, just as he himself abandoned Dido. Sometimes his reading involves just total lack of comprehension. Presented with the magnificent shield depicting Roman history in the future tense, Aeneas rejoices in the image, ignorant of the reality. Rerum quignarus imagine gaudent. And his final reading of a work of art, the golden baldric taken from Pallas that Turnus is wearing, which depicts the Danaids' murder of their husbands on their wedding night, fuels the terrible wrath and burning fury that causes him to reject Turnus's supplication. How about as a model of religious piety, that pietas for which he is so famous? Not a disaster, perhaps, but far more problematic than is usually realized. For instance, the prophet Helenus in Book 3 tells him that the one thing above all he must do on reaching Italy is first, before anything else, pray to the divinity of Juno. The first thing Aeneas does on reaching Italy is pray to the divinity of Minerva. Lest the reader think this was a fluke, the same thing happens in Book 8. The god of the Tiber River tells him to get up at first dawn and pray to Juno, postponing Tiber's own honors until later. Aeneas gets up at dawn and prays to the Italian nymphs and Tiber. Aeneas does eventually get around to praying and sacrificing to Juno, but for the Romans, performing rituals correctly was essential. A ritual error was called a piaculum, a sin or mistake requiring expiation through a new offering, also called a piaculum. I have argued at length that Aeneas himself is ultimately the piaculum demanded by the religious logic of the Romans and the narrative trajectory of the poem, that his sacrifice of Turnus points to his own sacrificial death. But whether or not one accepts that argument, nearly all readers agree that Aeneas's brutal rampage after the death of Pallas in Book 10, which includes such atrocities as his sacrifice of a priest and his taunting of victims who appeal in the name of fathers, brothers, and sons, is a mockery of pietas and an outrage to basic standards of human decency. Little wonder then that when I first started reading the Aeneid, I always found myself rooting for the other characters, especially Dido and Turnus, whose happy lives were shipwrecked by the proto-Roman juggernaut. The first time I really started to have sympathy for Aeneas was during the summer of 1994 at an NEH Institute at Emory University on reading Virgil's Aeneid in the humanities curriculum, but not because of the seminar itself. On Friday of the first of the 6 weeks, a nagging pain in my right calf became too strong to ignore, and I went to the teaching hospital on campus for an ultrasound. It turned out I had a potentially life-threatening blood clot and had to spend the next week hooked up to an IV, then the remainder of the time with my leg elevated in a wheelchair. Like Aeneas, I had been blown off course. My desires had been thwarted. No longer a free agent, I was dependent on the kindness of others. Thanks to the incredible generosity and humanity of those all around me, this turned out to be a pretty soft landing, but it still gave me a taste of the frustration of helplessness. And it helped me to see what matters about Virgil's admittedly flawed hero, why the Aeneid is a poem of adulthood. Aeneas does not get to do what he wants to do. It is hard to forgive him for his stilted parting speech to Dido, which instead of the outpouring of love we want to hear has zingers like, I shall speak a few words on behalf of my case. And if I could live my life the way I wanted to, I'd be back rebuilding Troy. But the brilliant half line at the end sums up with restrained perfection the eternal conflict between duty and desire. Italiam non sponte sequor. I'm pursuing Italy, not by my own choice. In that sacrificial paradigm lies yet another uncomfortable but important message. I mentioned earlier that Virgil leads Dante through almost all of the Purgatorio, but he cannot lead him all the way. Because he and the other pagans lived before Christ, they never knew the one true God. As he tells us on the threshold of the Inferno, for such defects and no other sin, we are lost, and only so far afflicted that without hope, we live in desire. Senza speme vivemo in desio. Surely this is one of the saddest lines in the whole poem. On the threshold of paradise, Dante finally beholds Beatrice, and he quotes Dido's words as she feels herself falling for Aeneas. I recognize the traces of the ancient flame. Disordered human erotic love is transformed before our eyes into real and lasting love for the Creator, the goal of Dante Pilgrim's journey. He turns to tell Virgil the thrilling news, but Virgil has disappeared. Like Aeneas, destined to die 3 years after his poem's end, Virgil is destined to lead others to the enjoyment of something that he himself will never see. Dante provides a beautiful image for this self-sacrifice in Virgil's meeting with the poet Statius, who lived during the 1st century of the Christian era. In the Purgatorio, Statius tells how the prophecy of Christ in the 4th eclogue contributed to his conversion, even though Virgil himself did not understand the purport of his own words. You acted like a man who goes by night, who carries the lamp behind and doesn't help himself, but makes the people in back of him learn it. When you said, the age is being renewed, justice returns, and the first human time and a new offspring descends from the sky. Through you, I became a poet. Through you, a Christian. The lamp behind, il lume dietro. The same could be said of Aeneas, striving for the glorious Roman future that he will not live to enjoy. As I've observed of Dante's brilliant perception of the almost but not quite Christianity of the Aeneid, the loss of the beatific vision is not a judgment on Virgil's soul. It is a comment on Virgil's poem. Pondering this image of the lamp behind, I was struck by similarities to the life of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. To all who interacted with her, she radiated joy and peace. As Malcolm Muggeridge says, in a dark time, she is a burning and a shining light. And yet, as we know from her private letters, her interior life after she founded her Missionaries of Charity was often characterized by feelings of desolation and darkness so painful as to be almost unbearable. The depth of her longing and her obedience exceeds my imagination. We can hear the voice of Jesus on the cross in her words. I understand a little of the tortures of hell without God. I have no words to express what I want to say. And yet last First Friday, knowingly and willingly, I offered to the Sacred Heart to pass even eternity in this terrible suffering if this would give him now a little more pleasure or the love of a single soul. I want to speak, yet nothing comes. I find no words to express the depths of the darkness. In spite of it all, I am his little one, and I love him, not for what he gives, but for what he takes. No matter how great her internal pain, she was determined to smile at Jesus and at everyone else, no matter what. If you only knew what goes on within my heart, sometimes the pain is so great that I feel as if everything will break. The smile is a big cloak which covers a multitude of pains. To the reader of Virgil, this cannot but recall his description of Aeneas washed up on the shores of Carthage, having lost, as he thinks, 2/3 of his men after he has given the remnant a cheering speech that shows him a true leader. Spem vultu simulat premit altum corde dolorem. He simulates hope on his face, pressing the pain down deep in his heart. So similar, and yet so utterly different. As different as martyrdom is from murder. For while Mother Teresa, smiling through her pain for Jesus' sake, reflected and perfected her deep holiness, for Aeneas, the pain finally bursts forth and overwhelms him. At the poem's close, where he sacrifices Turnus, burying his sword in his enemy's heart, condere, the same verb used for founding the Roman people, Aeneas is inflamed by furies and terrible in his wrath, a mirror image of Juno at the beginning. It is hard to feel good about this eruption of furor, that vengeful madness which constantly threatens the stability of the individual personality, human society, and even the universe itself. When we reach the end of the Aeneid, my students sometimes ask whether a page got left off by mistake. We are right to feel pity and fear as Turnus's soul flees, resentful, to the shades below. And yet, that act of impassioned violence was necessary to make way for the Roman Empire, the source of most of our language, our laws, our government, our arts and sciences, nearly everything that we are. In The Silence of Virgil and the End of the Aeneid, one of the few scholarly articles that has made me cry, Robert Edgeworth expresses this haunting paradox. Yet one great reason for the Aeneid's ceaseless pull on human hearts and minds is that many readers somehow sense that the poem's ambivalence is the way humanity is. We wish it were not so. What we long for is that cool, lucid clarity of justice for which we are forever doomed to thirst in vain. Virgil knows about the darkness within the human heart, and he shows it to us plainly here at the end of the Aeneid. But Virgil gives us more than tears for the way things are. He gives us hope. For the darkest deed that you or I shall ever do, even though it be to our everlasting discredit, may yet prove to be the cornerstone on which the brightest of futures may rest. Be it so. Be it so. Robert Edgeworth died of cancer in his 50s. This article, published posthumously, was actually assembled by his and my friend Rex Stem from two papers Edgeworth delivered shortly before his death. Like Aeneas, like all of us, at some point in our lives, he was blown off course. But he found even in the Aeneid's darkness, the lamp of consolation, the comfort of communion through the intimacy of reading with the poet of tears. What then does the greatest text teach us? Moral issues are too complicated for tweets. Erotic love is dangerous. The nature of evil does not change. The lust for shiny objects is deadly. Stability of the self and society is fragile. Suffering can transform cartoon bad guys into pitiable human beings. Freedom is not something to be taken lightly. Even our failures may light the way for others. The most meaningful life is not the one that maximizes self-gratification. Expressed this way, these all seem so trite. And yet really all the great truths are platitudes. And one of the purposes of art is to present them vividly to our imagination so that they can take root in our soul. Thousands of years ago, thousands of miles away, Virgil's Jupiter promised, "Upon these I place no limits in time or space. I have given empire without end." But he could hardly have foreseen what that empire would eventually become. To Virgil's god of Rome, for whom power was the highest good, these words of C.S. Lewis, a son of the British Empire that was Rome's heir, would have made no sense at all. "To be happy at home," said Johnson, "is the end of all human endeavor. As long as we are thinking only of natural values, we must say that the sun looks down on nothing half so good as a household laughing together over a meal, or two friends talking over a pint of beer, or a man alone reading a book that interests him, and that all economics, politics, laws, armies, and institutions, save insofar as they prolong and multiply such scenes, are a mere plowing the sand and sowing the ocean, a meaningless vanity and vexation of spirit." Nor could Jupiter, or Virgil have foreseen that Aeneas's descendants would be watching this video of a Catholic woman speaking in Waco, Texas, in the United States of America. Such are the ironies of history, the unintended consequences of empire. I close with that thought and with a note of thanks to the poet who held the lamp behind him, and to you for helping to keep it from going out.
Well, thank you. That was just wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And students, as we are thinking about Virgil now, maybe in a new way, I would love for you to drop some questions in the Q&A. We have one there to begin. We'll take probably just 5 or 10 minutes or so to ask some additional questions you may have about Virgil or the Aeneid, and then we'll kind of transition into any questions you may have about Baylor's program and having the opportunity to take classes from amazing professors like Dr. Hejduk. So our first question that we have is, what is your encouragement to Latin students who seem as if it is not worthwhile? I'm assuming they mean the study of Latin, perhaps in general, but perhaps the tackling of a great epic poem like the Aeneid. But if you could speak to that a little bit, because we all know this is a question a lot of Latin students ask: why am I doing this?
Absolutely, an excellent question, and I think part of it, in terms of the content, I addressed a little bit when I was talking about the different ways of translating that one word, inferet, Deus latio, right? When you read Latin in the original, you are getting the actual words of somebody who was writing 2,000 years ago. And just think about that. You have this direct communion with a human mind of somebody who lived thousands of years ago and whom millions and millions of people have read. And that, as I said, that one word, I mean, a translator, whether you translate it as marched his gods into Latium or his banished gods restored to rights divine, those are very, very different interpretations of that word. So if you actually want to understand an author who is as complex and has been interpreted in such opposite ways as Virgil, it's just, there is simply no substitute for reading it in the original. I mean, I just think, when interestingly, I learned Greek before I learned Latin, but the first time that I actually read Homer in Greek, it was sort of like the experience when Keats read him in Chapman's translation. Then felt I like a watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. I mean, it was just, it's like kind of like falling in love. So I realize that it's arduous. It involves a lot of memorization. Like anything worth doing in this life, it takes a lot of effort and work. And yet, few things are as rewarding as being able to just have that intimate and direct communion with people who lived thousands of years ago. Plus, it's not just Virgil that you get to read. I mean, when you learn Latin also, one thing that they don't tell you is that basically all intellectual discourse, almost all of it was conducted in Latin. There are still texts that have not been translated that are in Latin. German dissertations from the 19th century and earlier were written in Latin. So, if you are interested at all in intellectual history, it just is an essential tool. It also gives you just incredible insight into language in general, into the English language. I hate the sort of, it'll help you with your SATs and that sort of thing, but it will, right? It's just in terms of your understanding of of the English language and how language works all together. I mean, most people don't actually learn English grammar until they learn Latin. So anyway, it's worth it.
Thank you. That's so helpful. We have another question. Did Dante's choice of Virgil as a guide impact our view of his thoughts in the Aeneid?
I'm sorry, it impact whose views?
Impact our view of his thoughts in the Aeneid. So I think, yeah, did Dante's choice of Virgil as a guide impact our view of his thoughts in the Aeneid?
Yeah, so it was mentioned at the beginning that I'm interested in intertextuality, which is just a fancy term that literary theorists like to use for kind of the conversation between texts and the way authors are drawing on, especially an author like Virgil, who is just relentlessly intertextual and is constantly drawing on other authors and expecting you to sort of understand, okay, so Aeneas is like Homer's Achilles here and that sort of thing. One of the neat things about intertextuality is that it, even when you read something that was written after, it changes the way you read the earlier text. So I think that, I mean, there's, you know, so many, Virgil, what's interesting about Virgil as we know from Virgil's writings, is that we actually know almost nothing about Virgil himself. He's one of the most self-effacing of all authors. And as opposed to, for instance, Ovid, where you get the sense that a lot of Ovid is really about Ovid in some sense. He has all kinds of portraits of suffering artists, and he writes in the first person a lot. And Virgil, even when he does kind of speak in his own voice, it's usually just in a sort of the pose of sort of the epic narrator. It's not really very personal. So yeah, some of the scenes in the Inferno, I mean, that scene where Virgil is afraid for Dante's life and just picks him up like a mother picks up her baby when the house is burning down. I mean, it's wild. I mean, it does, I think it conveys a kind of just beautiful tenderness there. That, yeah, it does change, I think, the way you think about Virgil. But Dante is just such a brilliant reader and commentator on Virgil as well. That for instance, you know, the famous scene with Paolo and Francesca, where Dante, you know, sort of faints out because he's so moved by this thing. I mean, he there is sort of positioning himself as kind of a Dido figure, I think. And so he gets it, like he sees how moved Virgil was by his own character of Dido. Just one other little, I actually wrote an article about 10 years ago on the movie Inception. It's called Facing the Minotaur, Inception, Virgil's, I can't remember my own title now, but it's about Inception and Aeneid 6, basically. So the thesis of that was that Dido is actually kind of like the Minotaur at the middle of the labyrinth that Aeneas encounters in the underworld. And that idea came entirely from watching Christopher Nolan's movie, which I think is in fascinating dialogue with the Aeneid. So watching this, you know, 21st century movie actually made me read this poem that I'd been reading for decades in a different way and see things that I think are there, but that, you know, I hadn't seen before. And that's what's so exciting about this whole, you know, what we call the great conversation among all these texts, is that you're constantly, these authors are constantly in conversation with one another, and they draw you in and they help you to see things that you hadn't seen before.
Excellent. So our last question is, what resources do you recommend for a deeper study of Virgil and his works?
Well, I mentioned that reading Virgil's Aeneid in the humanities curriculum, that actually turned into a book with, I think that is in fact the title or something like that, edited by my good friend Christine Perkel. That has kind of a book by book going through the Aeneid and essays by a variety of different authors. So if you want sort of stuff on the books that aren't read quite as much, that's a great resource. I mean, I hate to sort of toot my own horn, but some of the things that I alluded to in my talk that I've written, I think actually are pretty decent kind of introductions. There's one, an essay I've written in a volume of kind of finding the common thread about the different great text that talks about the tradition of reading the Aeneid, Dante, and Ovid, and actually Ursula Le Guin, science fiction writer, their interpretations of Virgil. Yeah, for reasonably up-to-date bibliography, that volume I mentioned about Happy Golden Anniversary Harvard School, and just getting kind of an overview of different kind of personal reflections from senior scholars. That's a fun one. Yeah, sorry, but also that monograph that I wrote in 2020 about Jupiter and Augustan Poetry. That's not a bad introduction. And I say it's not just because, I love to tout my own works. Of those, obviously I do, but those, I like to write things that are basically accessible to the general reader and that are reasonably up to date in terms of bibliography. So that's not a bad place to start.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I think this is a great time for us to introduce Dean Henry. He's joined us, and we're so glad to have him with us. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Rachel. It's good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to have you with us this evening. I am so amazed at Dr. Hejduk and what she brought to the table this evening to give to our students, and what a delight to listen to her talk on Virgil and give our students a little bit of a sense of maybe what sitting in a class would be like at an institution like Baylor. And so we'd love to have you talk a little bit about the honors program at Baylor and the tradition of the liberal arts there, and what potentially could be some great things that our students, CLT students, could experience there.
Yeah, well, Rachel, I'll say just a couple of things. I know people have evening schedules to carry on with. I caught the tail end of Dr. Hejduk's talk. Unsurprisingly, it was erudite. It was interesting, inspiring, even encouraging for those of you who are beginners or old hands at reading Virgil. And I just offer that as a paradigmatic example of the kind of education we care about at Baylor. Everything is guided by our mission. Those of you out there who know anything about Baylor should know that we're a Christian university. Our mission is to educate men and women for worldwide leadership and service by integrating academic excellence and Christian commitment within a caring community. And, I could talk at length about all the components of that mission. Those are things that we care deeply about. Baylor's a mid-sized university, about 15,000 undergraduates. About 1 in 10 are in the Honors College. So we have about 1,400 to 1,500 students in the Honors College. So we have all the benefits of a significant major national research university that sports something like 125 or 130 different majors that undergraduates can pursue. Big time athletics, if you like that sort of thing. And yet we also, with the Honors College, have the benefits of a really outstanding elite Christian liberal arts college in which there is community, in which there is camaraderie, in which there is shared vision organized around reading the great books. And so all of our students do that, whatever their major might be in the university, the different ways of pursuing honors at Baylor. But no matter what that distinct path looks like for a student. It's always grounded in what Dr. Hejduk named as a great conversation. And so we want our students to read Homer and Plato and Aeschylus and Virgil and Augustan and Aquinas and Dante and Shakespeare and Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, Cormac McCarthy. We take it all the way to the 21st century. And so it's our privilege to do that. Our students go on to great successes, and it is a blessing and a stewardship for us to be engaged in that educational project. And so those who listened in tonight, we welcome your interest in Baylor. We'd love to visit with you more, give you opportunities to meet other faculty members like Dr. Hejduk. And certainly if there are any questions this evening, we'd be happy to try to field those and give good answers.
Sorry, I muted myself. So just a question about the application process to the Honors College. Do students, how does that work? Do students apply to the university and then have a separate supplement to the Honors College, or are they invited to apply to the Honors College once they've submitted that initial university application? Can you talk us through that process a little bit?
Sure. The conversation can begin at different points, but the most natural means of getting engaged with us in the application process is, yes, first through an application to the university. And then as part of that application, students are asked whether they are interested in the Honors College. Students of academic ability will be hounded a little bit. Are you sure you're not interested? We haven't heard that you're interested. We think you really ought to be interested. And so then the application to the Honors College is a separate additional process, but we try to make it fairly compact. We know there are lots of application essays to be written and dreams to be chased. And so we want a sufficient but not excessive space and time to be invested in our process. And then we do what admission committees do. We look at what students are bringing with them, where they have studied, what they have studied, what their aspirations are, what their sense of stewardship over their own lives and futures might be, and whether or not we think they resonate with the kind of education that we have to offer, described as I was putting it a few minutes ago. And so it's always exciting for us. I encourage those of you who are exploring a variety of colleges or universities, be ambitious, think boldly, dream, have a largesse, have a generosity of spirit, a magnanimity about you. Don't be faint in your ambitions or small in your dreams. Let admissions committees, those of us at Baylor, certainly among them, know what you care about, what you hope to do in the world. Those things are exciting for us as we think about how to be stewards over educational opportunities for our students.
That is a wonderful piece of advice for students, and something that, I think more students need to hear. So I appreciate you saying that to our students. We have another question from a student that says, what makes an honors college different from a regular college? So in terms of Baylor, I guess what would be the difference of experience for a student who was just admitted to the university versus the experience of the honors college student? How would those two things look different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at the point of departure for an answer, and I'll be concise here, for me, thinking Christianly, is the line of scriptures, Jesus' words, actually, to whom much has been given, much more is required. I think if you have the ability to be challenged, to be nurtured in a way that honors education could, then you have a concomitant responsibility, a stewardship to exercise over that. So don't squander your gifts is one answer to the question. And honors education, honors college, like at Baylor, is a way not to be cavalier about the blessings that one has received through teachers and moms and dads and pastors and others who have invested themselves in your life to help call forth from you your best. That's what a good honors college will do. That's what we want to do. We have in our honors college a vision. It's animated by the university mission, but our honors college vision is to love truth, kindle faith, and cultivate virtue in friendship, study, and service to Christ and neighbor. And that gives expression to a kind of community spirit organized around truth, faith, and virtue that we pursue in the context of a collegiate society. There's a great esprit de corps, there's a great affection for one another. And because we have 1,400 to 1,500 students and about 40 full-time faculty members, we really have that intimacy of scale that makes possible proximity and meaningful conversation and the development of significant conversations that I think are to the lasting benefit of our students. And so I think that community is something that's also a highly desirable thing that we have to offer. And of course, it's just excellent. If you want a good education, you're going to get it.
That's wonderful. We have one last question, and then we'll wrap it up because we're about at our time, but I think this is a good one, an important one for students. We have a student who is really interested in pre-med, but would also like to do the great books or great texts courses through the Honors College. Is it possible to incorporate those things together in a college career?
Absolutely. As it turns out, about 30% of our Honors College students are pre-med. So this is normal for many of our students. There are different ways that process might look in our curriculum. And so probably more focused conversation would be useful if any, whether it's the one who asked the question or others have that interest. In our great texts major, for example, there is a pre-med track. And so there's the opportunity to do all of the great classical works, do all great medieval Christian works, but there are also some emphases upon the history and philosophy of science, and so opportunities to read some of those who shaped the field of modern science and some of the medical sciences in particular, whether it's Harvey on blood or so forth and so on. University Scholars, another of our majors, very popular for pre-med students. That group of students at Baylor actually has the highest MCAT scores and the highest medical school acceptance rates of any student group at Baylor. And they have 3 great text courses as a part of their curriculum. And so there are other ways it might look for our students, Rachel, but it's eminently possible. And, you know, someone who wants to be a doctor is about the healing of bodies. But we all know that our bodies are not all that is important about our life. And so I very much admire whoever asked the question for thinking about the desirability of those works that help point us to the deeper, richer meaning of our lives, that the transcendent aspirations we have for happiness, so that we might not merely be agents of healing for bodies, but you know, agents of healing perhaps for sick souls that come our way sometimes too.
Yeah, and I might just jump in here and say, you know, it's easy to forget, but doctors are in the business of suffering, right? And that's precisely what so much of the great conversation is about. And to go into that field without having considered those questions, I don't know. I want a doctor who's really thought about what it means to be human and what it means to suffer and what is valuable in life. And also, if you're pre-med, you should take Latin. Really great for you.
That's another great plug for Latin. Absolutely. No, but I think you made a very important point there, Dr. Hejduk, about how the study of what it means to be human should really inform how we live in our modern society. And we tend to think of that idea of just being, you know, people who are interested in the humanities, but really, I said to someone the other day, would you rather have someone in the sciences who has had a humane education or who hasn't? These jobs are all out there and they're all real careers and they're important things, but what would you rather have? Someone who has been exposed to the great tradition and entrenched in the great conversation, or someone who only cares about the latest and greatest research. So I think it's very, very important. I commend the work that you're doing at the Honors College. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for students. So hopefully some of our students will be engaged in further conversation with you and pursue some of those aspirations they have with your wonderful institution. So we're out of time this evening. So thank you again, both Dean Henry and Dr. Hejduk, for being with us tonight. And I hope our students really enjoyed this time. I know I have. It's been wonderful. CLT is just grateful to be able to partner with institutions like Baylor and to be able to have the opportunity to introduce our students to you directly. So thank you again. We're grateful for your time and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Best.
Thank you. So
Take care.
grateful for this opportunity. And by the way, students, I'm terrible at trying to multitask and chat and whatever, but feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is just julia_hejduk@baylor.edu, and I'm always happy to hear from you. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.